Good morning. I want to begin by saying that it's an honor to speak to you about the sport of surf fishing, which means so much to so many of you. And I think we need to begin by asking the question, why is the fishing so good here on the Outer Banks, and particularly at Cape Point? So it has to do with the geography of our coastline. Hatteras Island arcs out into the Atlantic about 30 miles from the mainland, and at Cape Hatteras, the warm Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current. The clash of currents has created the shallow sandbars known as diamond shoals and outer shoals. Fish are attracted to structures, and these shoals provide shelter, which in turn attracts larger fish. Also, the Outer Banks are located in the middle of the Atlantic coast and border two migratory fish basins. One is the Mid-Atlantic Bight, which extends from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras, and the other is the South Atlantic Bight, which extends from Cape Lookout to Cape Canaveral. Cape Hatteras is the dividing point between these two basins, providing anglers with diverse species of northern and southern game fish and a longer season than anywhere else. All of these features combine to make for excellent fishing grounds. When park planners in the 1930s were considering the Outer Banks area for a national seashore, they stated that the dramatic quality of the Cape Hatteras Formation pointing boldly into the ocean to form the geographical climax of our Atlantic coast is in itself notable. Here are some saltwater game fish that are typically caught off the Outer Banks. The variety of fish along the southeast coast has been known for centuries. This 16th century drawing by artist John White depicts the variety of fish to be found in southern and mid-Atlantic waters. Fishing provided a livelihood for the native Algonquian Indians. In this composite drawing of an Indian fishing scene, artist John White depicts a variety of fish, including hammerhead shark, triggerfish, shad, catfish, and burrfish. Fishing techniques include spearing fish, trapping them in a net, and fishing at night with a fire in the middle of a canoe. Some of the fish that were drawn by John White over 400 years ago are still common today, including shad, striped bass, catfish, and sheep's head. Of course, fishing has provided a livelihood for Outer Bankers for generations. Haul netting was a common way to catch fish commercially. The story of surf fishing at Cape Hatteras really should begin with Frank Stick. You may recognize the name. He was a talented artist and later became a real estate developer on the Outer Banks, but he was also an avid surf fisherman. In the 1920s, he co-authored the first book written about surf fishing called The Call of the Surf. I believe this quote characterizes his passion for the sport. No method of fishing in which I have indulged affords greater diversion or is more productive of satisfying results. I will go further and will say that no sport, not even the hunting of big game, has more enthralled me in those pleasurable throes of excitement which only the outdoorman knows, than have the battles I have waged with those great and goodly fish which so frequently take into their capacious jaws the bait of the surf fisherman. To feel the lift, the gentle mouthing, and then the irresistible tug and run of a 30-pound channel bass, to sense the jarring rush of the striper, to see the enormous length of a shark leave the waves in headlong leap, while the line runs like water from your reel, these experiences are sufficient to send the blood pounding through the body and to lift the sportsman into the ultimate heaven of happiness. Wow. Many of you can probably relate to what he's saying. Frank Stick plays an important role in this story. He was always in search of new, unspoiled areas to hunt and fish, so he visited the Outer Banks in the mid-1920s to surf fish. He fell in love with the remoteness and scenic beauty of the area and moved here in 1929. Frank Stick became a conservationist. His philosophy was that nature was not the selfish property of an individual or a group, but the property of generations to come. In 1933, he wrote an article in the Elizabeth City Independent newspaper making the case for preserving a large part of the Outer Banks as a national park. Stick was concerned that the country's appetite for development would eliminate pristine wilderness like the Outer Banks and deprive the average citizen of their valuable heritage. This type of development was beginning to happen in Nags Head at the time. Frank Stick was a very good writer. In this excerpt from his newspaper article, he promotes the Outer Banks as a recreation destination. Is it any wonder then that this long and narrow strip of beachland, which we refer to as the Lower Banks, is blessed with a healthful and a pleasant and invigorating climate? And is it any wonder that the sincere nature lovers and the great sportsmen of our country who pay yearly visits to this region here find romantic enchantment discoverable nowhere else upon our continent? Stick felt that the East Coast needed a national park to complement and compete with the large national parks established in the western United States. Stick's proposal gained traction among local, state, and national officials. He served as chairman of the Cape Hatteras Seashore Commission that acquired land to hold it until the federal government was prepared to develop the park. Frank Stick put his money where his mouth was. He donated the first parcel of land for the seashore, an oceanfront tract of 100 acres. In this photo, Frank Stick is third from the left. On the far right is Horace Doe. Horace was a well-known fishing guide at the time. He earned up to $5,000 a year as a guide. He also became the first caretaker and later superintendent at Wright Brothers, where he took a downgrade in pay. His salary as caretaker was only $1,200 per year. Park planners in the 1930s noted that less than 1% of the total coastline of the United States was in public ownership. They saw Cape Hatteras as a first step in preserving portions of the coast for public ownership and use. Several studies were done to determine if Cape Hatteras was suitable for the nation's first seashore park. Planners determined that more than 23 million people lived within 400 miles of Cape Hatteras. In the 1930s, Dare County began to promote the Outer Banks as, quote, a great ocean empire of recreation and health, unquote, and highlighted on their map hunting and fishing opportunities and cultural sites. Due to the efforts of Frank Stick and his contemporaries, Congress authorized the creation of Cape Hatteras National Seashore, the nation's first national seashore park, on August 17, 1937. There were delays caused by World War II, oil speculation, and land acquisition, so it would be another 16 years before the seashore was officially established in 1953. 5 years later, in 1958, a formal dedication ceremony was held in which the water from the Old Faithful geyser at Yellowstone National Park was mixed with water from the Atlantic Ocean in the first national seashore. A park naturalist described the seashore in this way in 1954. I rejoiced in the well-preserved spirit of isolation on this vast, vacant beach and quietly enjoyed the companionship of simple things of nature that compose and give life to this wild, desolate place beside the sea. Tourism increased in the 1950s as paved roads and state-run ferries made travel along the Outer Banks easier. The State News Bureau promoted the Outer Banks in 1953 and featured a photo of surf fishermen on the back cover. The March 1954 issue of We the People featured the new National Seashore on the cover and mentions that Cape Hatteras is one of the finest surf fishing areas on the Atlantic coast. As tourism increased, so did the popularity of surf fishing. The following photos were taken in the 1950s. And I really like this photo because the surf fishermen and women there don't seem to be fazed at all by that helicopter hovering overhead. And this is a favorite photo. The local residents were beginning to benefit from the popularity of the sport. This is Jake in his surf fishing taxi. In the 1950s, angling clubs became popular. The Cape Hatteras Angling Club was formed in 1957 and a year later held their first fishing tournament. And it's evident that fishing tournament dinners could be very elegant affairs in the early days. In the 1960s, the National Park Service promoted fishing on the seashore with this brochure. In 1963, the Herbert C. Bonner Bridge was completed linking Body and Hatteras Islands. This important link made it even easier to get to popular fishing spots on the seashore. And the following photos are from the 1960s. This is a really dramatic photo showing the turbulent waters at Cape Point. In 1972, the United States Postal Service commemorated the National Park Service centennial with a set of stamps featuring Cape Hatteras National Seashore. More and more, surf fishing was becoming a symbol of the seashore. There were also a number of first day cover envelopes featuring, you guessed it, surf fishing. One envelope refers to Cape Hatteras as Game Fish Junction. Here are some more surf fishing tournament dinner photos from the 1970s. Pat Weston tells me that the first place team wins the Lighthouse Trophy, but it's a floating trophy. A team doesn't get to keep it unless they win the tournament 3 times. And this appears to be a pretty good replica of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. It might even get John Havel's seal of approval. What do you think, John? Pretty good. And these are members of the Chickamaucomico Angling Club. I have to say I'm very impressed with the matching jackets and logos. These teams seem to be very well put together. And the following images are all from the 1970s. Of course, if you catch them, what do you have to do? Clean them, right? And here's some photos of the various beach buggies. We'll hear more about beach buggies from Bill Smith a little later, but I wanted to include a few photos. The Fish with a Ranger program also began in the 1970s. One of the charter members of the Cape Hatteras Angling Club, Chester Britt, approached the National Park Service about creating a fishing program, and Fish with a Ranger was born. This program introduced and instructed visitors in the basics of surf fishing techniques. And here's some 1978 brochures describing the Fish with a Ranger program. Former Superintendent Tom Hartman said, "To many of the participants, this fishing program is the first time they have held a rod and reel. The experience which they have with the resource and equipment may mold behaviors that will last the rest of their lives." And these photos were taken in the 1970s. And this is some literature that I found in the archives that was provided for participants in the program. The back of this booklet had an environmental message for fishermen: "You're the solution to water pollution." Right, very 1970s. The Dare County Tourist Bureau continued to promote fishing on the Outer Banks with this brochure in the late 1970s. And this surf fishing photo was featured on our 1980 brochure. Again, it's clear that surf fishing and Cape Hatteras go together. Here's some images from the 31st Annual Cape Hatteras Anglers Club Tournament in 1988. Lots of equipment there. And I think this might be my favorite slide in the entire presentation. It reminded me of a quote from our friend Frank Stick. "For better than an hour I sat there, just smoking and loafing, and becoming more convinced each minute that happiness should be spelled F-I-S-H-I-N-G, content to let the hours slip by and not caring a whoop-to-dee whether the fish bit or not." These fishermen were reminiscing about being stranded on Hatteras Island in 1990 when the barge hit the Bonner Bridge and knocked out a span. This was the only year that the Cape Hatteras Anglers Club tournament had to be canceled. And here's some happy fishermen with their catch. And these guys look like they have worked hard for their fish. Surf fishermen and women are well known for enduring harsh conditions for their love of the sport. And as the locals say, after Labor Day, the fishing gets serious. Of course, if they're not biting, you can always read a book. This is Kelly Hebner of St. Thomas, Pennsylvania. She was close enough to grab a rod if the big one came along. In this 1996 brochure, the Dare County Tourist Bureau listed 14 fishing tournaments. The Fish with the Ranger program was still going strong as we entered a new century. And as Dave mentioned, the program continues today. Fish with a Ranger is probably the most popular program we present on the seashore, and it's definitely the longest running program. And surf fishing at Cape Hatteras is still going strong. A recent survey revealed that 1 in 5 visitors to the Outer Banks engaged in some type of fishing. So the sport is a great stimulus to the Outer Banks economy. In closing, I think it's appropriate to return once again to Frank's stick. He writes, "A man may spend a day on the beach and come home at evening with an empty basket and yet count the day not wasted. Many things there are to be caught besides fish. The sunlight, the salty breeze that sweeps the dunes, healthful exercise, and also there is a certain satisfaction of the soul which comes to most of us when old ocean rolls before our eyes. There is a vastness about it and yet restfulness. Power and strength are expressed in every breaker, and yet the sonorous beat of them lulls us to sleep. The omnipotence of it all assures us of our own insignificance and unimportance in the scheme of nature. But at the same time, it satisfies us of the futility of worry and complaint over the small irritations of life." Amen to that. Frank's vision to preserve America's first national seashore for future generations became a reality. If he were alive today, he would be very pleased that we are celebrating the heritage of surf fishing today, a sport that was near and dear to his heart. He might be most proud of this fact that nearly 700 miles of shoreline was preserved around the country following the grassroots effort to establish Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Today, whenever I drive south on Highway 12, I'm comforted by the fact that most of the beach is preserved as a national seashore, and it is free of the development of the northern beaches. I hope you agree that we all owe a debt of gratitude to a man who came here in the 1920s looking for a remote place to surf fish. Thank you.